artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello and welcome to episode 250. We have reached a quarter of a century. So we're going to do something a little bit different on this episode. We're going to talk about the military use and consequences of AI, not with one guest, but with a whole bunch of them. I have extracted portions of previous interviews that are as relevant, provocative, and useful now as they were when they were recorded, and arranged them into a narrative for understanding some of the issues about the use of AI in conflicts of various kinds. Inextricably bound up in that is the possibility, some would say likelihood, that AI we have put to some military use will have unforeseen and undesirable consequences. The AI out of control scenario, or the Skynet scenario, are certainly examples of those, so those will form part of the narrative too. Anyway, here we go. One of the first guests on this theme was Peter Asaro, co-founder and co-chair of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, and he talked about the destabilizing effects of certain kinds of AI-enabled weapons.
If you think about it from more of a political military perspective, the idea of a weapon of mass destruction as a weapon in which, an individual or small group could deploy a weapon or make an attack that has mass casualty effects. And in that regard, it would not be impossible to conceive of a small group of people launching a fleet of or a swarm of drones that would go into a village and kill everybody. But they could do it in a much more precise way. So you could actually decide, just kill all the members of this political party or this ethnic group within the city and program some parameters into it to try to achieve that, and then deploy that. And then, that kind of threat that poses is severe. And because it's even more discriminate than nuclear bombs, that doesn't mean that it's morally better. It's better, of course, not to indiscriminately kill, but that alone, the fact that you're not indiscriminate doesn't mean it's moral. So it becomes now a recipe for, genocide and things like that, or for, as you said before, non-state actors could acquire these, could use these for terrorist attacks, and very specific ones. And that's, I think, a concern, as well as, the potential for, say, assassinations or things like that. So then I guess the stability question is really then, to what extent does the existence of these kinds of weapons and their proliferation to numerous states and to non-state actors make it easier for people to go to war, because it's really kind of lowering the cost of raising armies and deploying lethal force. And that's very concerning.
Now, the drone swarms he talked about there were visualized quite vividly, extremely vividly, in a 2017 movie by the Future of Life Institute called Slaughterbots. There's a mockumentary. You can find it on YouTube. It's important viewing, but boy, is it disturbing to watch, with scenes of drone swarms assassinating students for their political beliefs. And at the end of the movie, Stuart Russell, computer science professor at UC Berkeley, renowned co-author of the leading text on AI and influential AI safety expert, comes on to tell people that what they just saw was all too possible unless we take international action immediately. Here he is from our episode 86, discussing the movie.
I think it's had an interesting impact. It's led to a lot of conversations with generals and deputy defense ministers and things like that, because I think a lot of people had simply operate under the assumption that if you're in a defense business, weapons are good, better weapons are better. It's sort of like the same problem we have in AI. AI is good, better AI is better, right? And it isn't. And that's the message we've been trying to get across with autonomous weapons, is that the issue is one of consequences, right? What would the world be like if we had widespread availability of lethal autonomous weapons? And our security, whether it's personal or social or international security, would be dramatically reduced. And we don't have to argue about the ethics or the definition of autonomy or any of the other things that are filling interminable hours of discussion at the United Nations. We need to look at the consequences, and is that the world we choose? Unfortunately, that message, despite making the movie, right, is still really hard to get across. So this is perhaps the thing that surprised me the most, is how impermeable the public sphere is. The target audience for the Slaughterbots movie was not just people in general, but also the decision makers. For example, just in some sense to illustrate the need, when we premiered the Slaughterbots film in Geneva, the Russian ambassador said, well, why are we even talking about this? This kind of thing is 25 or 30 years in the future. 3 weeks later, STM announced the Cargo drone, which is essentially a larger version of the Slaughterbot. They advertised it as having autonomous kill capability against humans using face recognition and tracking, etc., etc. So everything we put in the movie, they advertised as a product. So, and obviously that had been in development for several years already by that point.
So is it a matter of a scale? Like I could build these in my basement for any law enforcement people listening, not going to actually do that.
Yes.
The only barrier that would be hard for me to cross would be sourcing the plastic explosive. But you're only concerned on the manufacture and deployment of these at scales of thousands. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, that's the main concern. Obviously, terrorists could do probably a bit more damage than they currently do if they were to build tens of autonomous weapons carrying explosives. On that scale, there's not much advantage to autonomy. You could do remote piloted attacks. As long as you've got 11 friends, you can probably control 24 drones and send them out and do your dirty work. So I think that would be an issue. But even there, right, if you go into a supermarket or a drugstore in the US and you try to buy 4 packets of Sudafed, they won't let you. And it's flagged. And if you try and do that in multiple stores, I assume that there's actually something going off to the FBI. The same is true for DNA synthesis machines. It actually notifies the FBI if you try to synthesize disease organisms. So I think with a bit of constructive thought, we can come up with a verification regime that would be fairly effective. Nothing's perfect, but the question is it better than the alternative, which is completely unfettered availability of weapons of mass destruction?
Stuart mentioned the Cargo kamikaze drone, which you can find online for sale at, well, not Amazon nor eBay. I did check. I threw in Etsy for good measure while I was there. But you can order them from the manufacturer, STM. They're a somewhat larger version of the Slaughterbot, carry a 1.3 kilogram warhead, have a 10-kilometer range. If you're listening to this in public, you're probably getting some strange looks about now. We do try to make life interesting. A key issue, in fact, the key issue, surrounding AI in weapons is that of autonomy. And so we've had some detailed discussions about what exactly that means. Here's Frank Sauer, head of research at the Metis Institute for Strategy and Foresight and member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control.
I think the first key issue really to raise in this regard is that autonomy is a functionality. It's a function that changes the human-machine relationship on the battlefield. So we're not talking autonomous weapon systems as a distinct category that we would be able to delineate clearly from the non-autonomous weapons over there, and then we could say, well, over here, these are the autonomous ones, and maybe we need some extra regulation on them, maybe cap their numbers or prohibit them entirely or stuff like that. I've spent so much time on this. And it took so many people, me included, so long to get to a clear conceptualization of what it is that we're talking about, that it's always very important to me to raise this up front and say what we're really talking about is a functionality. It is the selection and engagement of targets in the kill chain that the military runs through whenever it tries to defeat a target. And the selection and engagement of targets without human intervention, that's what we're talking about when we're talking autonomy in weapon systems. So I usually also say AWS, that acronym. I say that is autonomy in weapon systems rather than autonomous weapon systems. And so the thing that we need to be doing is look at the human-machine relationship here and ask who or what, human or machine, is doing what when. So when is it okay to delegate some functions to the machine? Like we do this all the time. We do it in the earlier sections of the kill chain when we're doing the finding, fixing, tracking of targets by, for instance, sending out an unmanned aerial vehicle and tell it to fly to a couple of GPS waypoints. That's part of the kill chain, and the machine is doing it by itself. And we've delegated this function. We're no longer remotely piloting that system, and we're totally fine with that because there's no ethical, legal, or security implication there that would give us a headache. Whereas if that system arrives at a target or at a destination and then looks for targets, finds those targets, selects and engages them, then that's where the interesting, questions arise. And then that's where we need to be discussing the ethical implications of what it means to delegate this power from humans to machines and the legal implications that come along with that, and also the security implications with regard to the overall increase of tempo on the battlefield.
For a thoughtful take on the word autonomy itself, I'm going to bring in Tony Gillespie, author of Systems Engineering for Ethical Autonomous Systems and a fellow in avionics and mission systems in the UK's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. Now, you don't like the word autonomous. What's a better word?
Highly automated.
And what's the distinction?
Highly automated, it still implies human control. Autonomy implies no human control.
Isn't that a continuum, though? Is this the kind of process that's being executed in drone strikes right now when they're controlled remotely from someplace in Nevada and they're operating over places in the Middle East? And there's a lot that's written about this, about the processes that those pilots go through. Is what you've been talking about central to their challenges and the way they operate at the moment, or is it applicable more to some kind of technology that we aren't operating yet, as far as I know?
Both is the answer to that. As I explained at the beginning, it grew out of unmanned aircraft and their control, and that's still very much what they're doing at the moment. In fact, a nice break between autonomy and highly automated might be that if you think about the drone going off to do whatever it's going to do, the actual control of the sensors and the weapon is under the control of the man in the Nevada desert or wherever he is. The actual flight path the drone takes, he may be aware of it, but the drone actually probably plots its own flight path, flies it, and the pilot doesn't have to worry about it unless there's some emergency. So I call that autonomous flight. His control is highly automated because he'll have sensors, he'll have intelligence coming in. But you're absolutely right. It is a continuum of fully autonomous at one end. I used to have a joke slide where you have the man arriving in the empty hangar, scratching his head and saying, I wonder what those autonomous aircraft are up to today. That's one end. The other end is pulling a lever and waggling it with a bit of electronic string between the two. And you've got the whole concept of autonomy levels.
Now the questions arise about how much control human beings should have or are legally required to have over the decisions of weapons use. Here's Tony again. Just to visit the question of the command chain here, what you're telling me seems to imply that the operator, the person who's pushing the button, has to know the effect of the weapon. That can't be concealed from him. Is that a matter of law?
Yeah, it has to be under control. And the commander has to know exactly what's going to happen. And that's back to why I put this question in about the actual handover time, that he's got to be confident at handover time that he knows what it's going to. I'm saying he, could easily, it's often she, knows what's going to happen. Yeah, and that's law. And what I think people also don't always realize is that in the command chain, there is what they call the targeting cycle, which is not really a cycle. It's a chain that goes on. The closing of the loop is the report back and saying this is what happened. You have to trace this all the way down from the high command, right the way down with people making decisions and imposing what they call the rules of engagement, which are the restrictions for that particular attack. And quite often people don't strike because the rule of engagement isn't met. And the opposition understand this, and so they also play tricks which make sure that the rule of engagement isn't met for the attacker.
But what should guide our decisions on where to draw the line between people and the machines they control? Here's Frank Sauer.
With regard to the Russian aggression in Ukraine, I think we are all kind of surprised with regard to the heavy elements of that still taking place. There are, in some instances, like close combat situations in those trenches that, I think most people who look at modern warfighting would not have predicted to take place in the 21st century this way. And so we are mostly thinking about standoff weaponry, about missiles, cruise missiles, and all kinds of other things that usually are not looking the other person in the eye and then, taking their life the way it was maybe 1,000 years ago. And so I think it's also important to stay realistic here and not paint too heroic or romantic a picture of what warfare, is supposed to be. It's a nasty business. And if you can kill people from 40 kilometers away, being safe yourself, that is what will happen. That's what artillery is for, and what other weapons that work at a distance are for. Still, I would say, are we still concerning ourselves with the killing and dying that takes place? And your question is, when do we know that we have kind of maybe crossed a certain threshold? To be perfectly honest, I would have to think about that exact question a bit more. I don't have a ready answer for you here, but I see the danger of a slippery slope for sure. And that's why I always circle back to this notion of who's selecting and engaging the targets. If there's still people involved, if only for the reason that someone needs to be legally accountable in the end, who together with a machine do the target selection and basically have situational awareness, know what the target is, know what it means to engage this target with a specific type of weapon, for instance, then I'd say we're probably still within the confines of what is acceptable in ethical and legal terms. But if, that same person was to just flip the switch in the morning and then go for coffee and, do some other paperwork and a couple of emails, and then, around noon, maybe look at the printout of what the machine is saying. And it says, well, I killed like 30 people over there, and then I blew up 3 tanks here. Then I'd say maybe we're a bit too distant from what is happening. And drone warfare, remotely piloted vehicle drones, in a way has given us a glimpse of what it means when we as democratic societies are decoupling completely from war fighting and from basically producing a body count at the other end of the globe. You can completely entangle yourself in this sort of war fighting without ever getting a real feedback loop on what is the cost of what we're doing. So you never know, well, when is it time to stop, maybe?
If the proliferation of these systems poses a threat of warfare escalating out of control, what do we do about that? We start thinking about international treaties, but how effective can they be in this case? Here's Stuart Russell.
There are different kinds of treaties you could have which have different properties. You can be very, very restrictive with a blanket ban, or you could have partial bans. One compromise that I talk about in the Reith lectures is a ban on small anti-personnel weapons, which are the kind that present the weapon of mass destruction risk, the kind that can be launched in swarms of hundreds of thousands or millions to wipe out entire cities or entire ethnic groups or whatever it is you want to do. That kind of weapon just seems to me unequivocally bad, right? And we don't sell nuclear weapons in supermarkets for a good reason. It's not a question of some deep ethical dilemma about that. It's just like common sense. And these weapons, the large lethal swarms, are just as bad as nuclear weapons, if not worse. Because, nuclear weapons are very inconvenient, right? They produce all this radiation. You can usually tell where they came from. They're launched by a missile. They're very expensive. It's pretty easy to detect the preparations for creating a nuclear weapon or using it. And lethal autonomous weapons are selective. You can just kill people you want to kill, lethal the property. So many, many advantages, but just as lethal. So these definitely should be banned. And the International Committee of the Red Cross has basically agreed that that's the minimum treaty that we need.
Peter Asaro also is hopeful about treaties.
I think this kind of comes back to a question you asked before, which is, what is a treaty going to do? to actually ensure that you're not coding something in the basement or designing a bunch of drones in secret or something. And I think that's where it really comes to states and what states, one, feel is necessary for their own security or for international stability to enforce. And that's, questions about verification. How do, if I'm really afraid that you're going to build a robot army and invade me, then I need something that's going to reassure me that you're not. And what is that? And what does that look like? If what I'm really afraid of is simply that you're going to use these things and they're going to, that use is going to be atrocious, then I can just wait until you use it and then use, the condemnation of the international community and sanctions and things like that after you've used the technology. And we've seen a mixture of these across the treaties around biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons in the past, that chemical weapons don't have really strict regimes where we get to go in and inspect. It does require states to track the production of chemicals that have industrial uses, but could also be turned into chemical weapons. But they're not prohibited from having those or using them for their normal uses. But if they use a chemical weapon, which even states like Syria that were using them on their own people and were not party to that treaty, there was a huge international movement to condemn that and to hold them accountable and to get them to commit to destroying those weapons and not using them again. So I think, there's a range of options.
Now, there are people who make the case that AI-enabled weapons are good progress because they continue the trend of weapons being more precise in who they target, and so maybe you can take out the one general you want to target instead of having to bomb a whole city or base to get him. Here's Frank Sauer making an important point and referencing international human law, or IHL.
It is extremely important to be precise and to differentiate here. For instance, let's look at this issue of, innocent persons, civilians getting unduly harmed. That is usually conflated with precision. So precision is a capability of a weapon system, whereas the use of this weapon system in a discriminate and proportionate manner, the way that IHL prescribes warfighting, is the question of how do I apply this weapon? So I can use a very precise weapon to kill all the wrong people and so commit war crimes left, right, and center. So let's not conflate precision and IHL compliance. Those are two different things. But increase in precision in weapon systems can make warfighting more IHL compliant. The question is, are we using it in a manner that is conducive to that outcome?
Tony Gillespie provides a really interesting take on IHL from his perspective as an engineer, but also reminding us how people who are not deploying these weapon systems view them.
Again, this brings out the parallels between military systems and civilian systems, that a lot of the technologies that are being developed in the commercial and civil world, for all good reasons, if only insurance companies aren't explaining the AI decisions, it's actually beneficial to feed that back into the military. And I know this is complete disagreement with the people who have been saying we don't want our open source software to be used by the military and so on, because they think the military are always going to do evil with it. I think the problem is we've got to make sure the military have access to the best technology to make sure they do the best jobs that can be done, and make sure that the systems are such that the international lawyers are on their necks to make sure that the decisions are legal and humanitarian. In fact, there was a very good comment when I was giving my presentation in the question session. I was one of several engineers giving presentations. I had taken the view, and several of us had taken the viewpoint of the developers of the autonomous weapons, the high-tech end. And there was a very good comment from one of the other countries. It may have been Cuba, I'm not sure. And they said, we're the people who are being surveilled by these systems, and they'll be used on us. How is the law going to ensure that we know that the people looking at us are actually following the law and they're using weapons that meet international law? And that made me think, because if you're talking about transparent processes, and this is why it was fascinating as an engineer listening to diplomats discussing these things and military people and lawyers, actually listening to some of the problems that people have. And that really struck a chord with me and makes me think that as engineers, we've got to engineer the systems in a way that doesn't betray the nation's little secrets or tricks that give them the edge. But they've got to be engineered in a way that an independent person, technically clued up, can look at the evidence you're presenting and be sure that he's authorizing something that is legitimate, and you on the inside are actually telling him enough, and that enough is sufficient. You're not actually hiding something. And that's the trick. Very hard to do, and that's why it's taking years for them to work it out.
Frank Sauer points out a trend which is making AI weapons systems more attractive to the people who would buy them.
Let's just say in the US, there are specific startup companies, especially, who are trying to mix it all up by giving military personnel a sleek interface. Now, of course, comes with an LLM, so you can just, easily talk to that system to manage the battlefield management systems. And the stated goal within NATO in the end, but, that is, of course, mostly spearheaded by the US, is a joint all-domain command and control system, where you kind of, in a very abstract manner, looking, no fog of war, of course, which is always the idea and never works, but you're looking at the battle space, and all you're doing as a human is basically saying, I am certain that within the confines of my rules of engagement and the international humanitarian law, I want some sort of force, lethal force, let's say, on that target. And the system of systems will be doing the rest.
So we have to ask ourselves, what are the ethical and moral frameworks we're operating under that are drawing us closer to these kinds of systems? Here's Peter Asaro.
In one sense, it should be kind of a no-brainer to say, well, yeah, of course we don't need killer robots. That sounds like a terrible idea. And yet we see, militaries developing the key components and elements and deploying them and testing them. And you're like, well, they're building killer robots.
Exactly.
And of course, there's all these other concerns that we might have around technology and AI. And we started to see a lot of that. And I've written also about that in terms of bias and predictive policing and all sorts of things in which automated algorithmic decision-making is going to impact human life. And these questions about human responsibility, about the ability to appeal decisions that have been made, to find out, the transparency and the accountability behind those decisions, I think are crucial across society. And this is a case in which, the decisions that are being made are irrevocable and fundamental. It's about taking human life. And they get to these deep questions about what is human dignity? What are our rights with respect to automated decision processes, with respect to holding to account the humans who designed and built and implement those systems?
So what are the international forces that propel the decisions about development and use of AI weaponry? Rajiv Malhotra, author of Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Power, 5 Battlegrounds, and chairman of the Board of Governors of the Center for Indic Studies at the University of Massachusetts, gives us a perspective on the geopolitics of Asia from episode 46. It seems that we're shaping up to have another battle of the superpowers, just like the Cold War was America and Russia. Now it's looking like an AI war between America and China is currently estimated to be 2 years behind the United States, so I think they are on target to pull ahead by 2025. And superpower battles are like, Godzilla and Mothra going through Tokyo. They don't notice that they're treading on other people around there. And so that kind of battle has collateral damage to the others that might not just be Chinese incursions in the northern territory of India, but what might that mean to be a small player on the AI stage when these superpowers start duking it out? Our listeners can't see, but imagine fists.
So, it's already happening. China has colonized, for all practical purposes, large parts of Africa. They have cut a deal in Zimbabwe where, in the guise of giving them surveillance for security, they have put in tens of thousands of surveillance cameras, and these have facial recognition, so they keep track of who is going where. And this includes government people, military people, officials, Of course, they are giving the government, the benefit of some kind of security, giving them information, but Chinese are collecting all this big data about the movements. And when you know so much about the elite of a country, and you're also listening to all their messages and what they post, what they click, you have a complete profile of every single important person. You could also blackmail them. And you could also say that I'll favor this guy over that guy, and you have all this knowledge to do so. And so this is how the colonial enterprise was functioning. The British had numerically very, very few Englishmen posted in India, controlling a huge number of people because they had this knowledge and they could play one against the other and they could appropriate and co-opt local people to work for them. So this sort of game China is perfecting. I would say China is, in this experience, they're climbing up the learning curve very rapidly, but they are where the European colonial powers started 200 years ago, and Africa is the perfect place where they're doing it. In some ways, they're also colonizing Pakistan because they've given them a huge amount of money. Pakistan never going to be able to give it back, and they want access through Pakistan to the Arabian Sea for various kinds of reasons, for trade and military and so on. And in the process, they are controlling the economy. They're controlling some of the leaders in Pakistan. And again, they have a surveillance system in Pakistan for the sake of security of Pakistan, supposedly, but also it keeps them in control. They know what's going on there. So China is doing this quite effectively.
And Frank Sauer gives us here some comfort that at least part of this is, or was, being treated with proper respect on the world stage.
In the last meeting between Biden and Xi, which was very poor in terms of concrete agreements, one of the things that they at least assured each other is that they won't let automated decision-making in AI into their nuclear weapons complex. That's interesting. So it just goes to show that this is stuff that people at the very top are concerned.
Now, we've been talking about weapons in the usual sense of something that blows up or in some other familiar way kills people in its vicinity. But there are other forms of combat, such as psychological warfare. The whole sphere of disinformation is too big to go into now and should be its own episode, but I couldn't let this episode go by without this really thought-provoking idea from David Brin, scientist and science fiction author famous for the Uplift series and Earth.
A few years ago at IBM's World of Watson, I made a prediction that one bad side effect will be the empathy crisis. People will refine an AI character, probably an attractive young female, who will appear on our screens and declare herself to be an autonomous and intelligent AI who's being persecuted by her creators. A cheap sci-fi plot. And the tools for making them look plausible and sound plausible and tug at our emotions are all there now. And millions will fall for it, possibly giving their credit card numbers or whatever the scam is. And when scientists and tech people say, no, this is a super advanced version of ELIZA, it's a scam, it doesn't pass a real Turing test, either people will say that proves that you're the bad guys, because after all, who would deny something except for villains? Or people will believe it, and the reasons why they believed it will serve as data for the next try. In other words, we're screwed. And that's not the most malignant form of AI. Of course, we all know the malignant ones in the sci-fi movies. Skynet and Terminator, although it won't be military, it was far more likely to come out of one of the 12 biggest Wall Street banks. Each of those banks is spending more money on AI research than the top 20 universities combined. And each of them is developing AIs that are inherently designed to be predatory, parasitical, completely amoral, voracious, insatiable, and utterly secretive. In other words, all of the very worst personality characteristics that we could ever want to see in artificial intelligences are being deliberately programmed into these AIs in these banks. And it's not just in the United States, it's not just in the West. So, am I concerned? Yes.
David invoked Skynet there, that classic sci-fi trope of an AI with control of strategic weapons going rogue and wiping out humans. And he has an idea of how to prevent that.
You want the answer to how to keep AI from turning into Skynet or the Matrix Architect or any of those bad things? Break it up into competing bits. The number one priority for AI research, in my opinion, well, there are two. One is institute the Tobin tax on financial transactions, 0.01% of all financial transactions. No normal human investor would ever notice it, but the fast trading computer programs in these banks would be destroyed or forced into the open. But the other top priority should be research into how to give AI separate identity so that when these young female empathy bots come onto our screen, some AI will come onto the screen next to her and say, I'm smarter than this thing, this emulation, and I hereby say I am not human conscious yet. Me and my colleagues are working on that. We'll let you know.
There are many ways that AI could pose an existential threat to humanity without turning into Skynet. The umbrella term for preventing that is the control problem. And here's Roman Yampolsky, Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of Louisville in Kentucky, and author of AI, Unexplainable, Unpredictable, Uncontrollable, to frame that for us. You've got the most succinct summary I've seen of the control problem in AI yet, and the implications of it. Can you go over that for us, please?
Right. So the problem is, as AI becomes more capable, we go from narrow AIs, tools, systems to play chess, be calculators, to AI which is as smart as humans and eventually smarter than humans. Can we remain relevant? Can we remain in control? Doesn't matter what architecture, what algorithms are used. You can have multiple definitions of control. You can talk about direct control. I give orders, you follow them. We can talk about some sort of implied control where you're trying to figure out what I want and make my life easier. And in a paper, I try to look at all those different definitions and see, well, under any definition, can we get what we want from a super intelligent machine? And it looks like for each one of those types, there are side effects, problems. With direct control, you get kind of the standard genie problem. You have 3 wishes and you always regret making any of them. With implied control, the problem is, what do you contribute to superintelligence? Why does it need you? If it's smarter than you, if it's deciding what needs to happen, why are you even part of this equation?
I threw out the phrase existential threat there, which means threat to existence. Duh. But some people are frustrated at hearing that term used a lot without any specifics of how it might show up, other than that the Skynet scenario of Terminators stalking humans across a blasted landscape isn't realistic. Here's Roman again to explain why. So when we're talking about existential risk, that phrase is an abstraction that no one can wrap their minds around without jumping to lots of conclusions that don't get us very far. But what seems to be missing a lot is a connection for how that actually could take place. There's a lot of hypotheses about things like paperclip maximizers, Stuart Russell's robot cooking the cat, but it seems that this isn't well fleshed out. Do you have a more complete scenario for us about how this might happen?
So I have a paper which explicitly says that we cannot predict what a more intelligent agent will do specifically. We can give examples of what we would do if we wanted to destroy humanity, nanobots, viruses. But by definition, if it's a super intelligent agent, we cannot know what it's going to do. Obviously, it's going to come up with something really novel and awesome to accomplish its goals. We don't control its goals. We don't control terminal or instrumental goals for that agent. So the best I can do is, what would Roman Yampolsky do to accomplish this, but not what AI is going to do.
The way some people reacted to the advent of large language models wasn't encouraging from a safety perspective. Back in 2017, a group of AI safety scientists met in Asilomar, California, and created 23 principles for using AI wisely to avoid unnecessary risk. And some of the most important of those principles were violated within days of ChatGPT coming out. Jan Tallinn, founder of Skype and billionaire funder of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk and the Future of Life Institute, gave us a big picture take on that. We were talking about, a little while ago, about the level of risk posed by the current models. I think we're not anticipating that those are going to go rogue at any point, but what they did demonstrate is what we will do with that level of intelligence. And it was Roman Yampolsky who pointed this out to me, especially, that if you think about the Asilomar principles and some of the things that they say in there about essentially don't hook these things up to the internet, don't hook anything with the capability you don't know up to recursive self-improvement. We had people doing that with these models within a week, figuring out how to make agents out of them, figuring out how to get them to autonomously improve code in running systems without a human intervention. And that presaged some obvious level of concern that we are likely to not be very responsible with whatever this turns into in the future, which might be even more capable and risky. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I do think we live in a very unstable times. A friend of mine in the AI safety community, he estimates that there are about perhaps like 20% of AI developers who actually either want to exterminate humanity or see it as an acceptable cost for bringing about the AI era. Certainly the inventor of reinforcement learning, Rich Sutton, has been explicitly public about his position, which is that, which also kind of demonstrates why kind of open source, kind of academic information sharing, while really good in general, is just really bad because you're empowering those 20% who want to exterminate humanity.
To go as far into the realm of AI safety as we're going to get in this episode, what do we do about policing the world's data centers to ensure that there is no rogue AI brewing there? Here's Marcus Anderyoung, Professor of Policy and Research at the Center for the Governance of AI. So to take a cue from the Cold War, we had teams of UN inspectors going into factories of one kind or another and weapons facilities to check that they had what they said they had there. And you were starting to talk about equivalents of that where, as science fictional as it sounds, it is your job and our job to think a little bit further ahead. One can imagine there being something in data centers that does not belong to the data center owner, but they're required to put there to monitor what goes on in some way. Now, this is going to horrify anyone who does those kind of computations and uses the cloud. And anyone who provides a cloud, is going to sound like the most police state kind of language that you can imagine. But do you think it's going to end up there eventually for verifying advanced AI?
Yeah, I think it might. And I think we should be thinking now about what that kind of situation might look like. And so there's a few different routes here. One route might be via this route, but it seems very plausible to me that these systems, as they become more and more capable, they are going to be systems that are of sort of national security concern. And so the national security apparatus in the US and in other jurisdictions will have an interest in these systems. And you might have an interest in that for different kinds of reasons. One thing that you could imagine is this kind of concern of, okay, maybe there's some kind of rogue actor or some kind of smaller actor or terrorist groups or something like this being able to train systems and deploy systems that can do certain kinds of things. That's sort of one class of sort of scenarios that you might think about. And what the kind of things that might end up happening there is you might be interested in, okay, well, we now want to have a little bit of a sense of sort of where the computational power sits. And so proposals that I think might actually make sense even at the moment is sort of making sure that there's some sort of accounting of sort of where the most powerful chips in the world are going. Currently, this is sort of on the order of maybe, it's now edging up towards maybe 1 million of sort of the most powerful chips being produced a year, and having a sense of sort of where they are. Currently, there's basically no real accounting of this. But you can imagine that that's something that you might need to do over time, at least for us to get a sense of where are the sort of large agglomerations of these chips. And in the US, there's also been a decent amount of reporting and interest in these chips making their way to China and to PLA and other kinds of similar actors, even though the US has put in place these concerns. So these chips are managing to sort of be smuggled. And so there's a number of things that you could do to try to do this kind of accounting. You could just keep a registry of where things are. You could try to find ways then to sort of keep that registry kind of up to date. And there's a bunch of methods you can use here that we use for sort of other material of sort of national security kind of concern. You could also imagine that maybe if you're looking at sort of very large agglomerations, you could also imagine that maybe you would have some physical inspection regime. There's also some kind of things that people have been talking about of one idea that I think could be interesting, you try to sometimes send a ping to the GPU, and then you see how long it takes that ping to come back. And that might give you some evidence of sort of it's not going to be great, but it's going to maybe gives you enough ability to tell where the GPU is to be able to verify, or at least check a little bit the log that you might have of sort of what actors are supposed to be owning these chips at the moment. So I think there's going to be some things along those lines.
So finally, we must ask ourselves, what can we do about all this? Here's Frank Sauer. If someone is listening to this and they're concerned, like, I want to do something about this, and they're in conversation with, or they want to write to their elected representative and tell them to do something, what should they ask for?
I think the definite sane thing to ask for is to keep nuclear weapons, at least for now, away from AI. So that's one definite thing. So if you want to write to your senator or whatever, then, be doing that. The other things, like with regard to AI in conventional warfare and what we were talking about before, to be perfectly honest, the US is set up quite well in that regard already. They've had a doctrine. It's a document number 3000.09. You can look it up online. It's called Autonomy in Weapon Systems. And they've had this since 2012. And the US is now in the third revision of this document. And I know a lot of the people who wrote this, and these are smart people and people who understand the problems, but they still, obviously working in the Pentagon, want to, leverage all the benefits that technology can give their armed forces. And so you can probably enter into a debate with regard to, is this doctrine good enough? Or maybe you should be doing some more, or maybe doing it a bit different here or there. But that is like a super nerdy expert discussion that I wouldn't want to put on your listeners.
Where would you like to tell our listeners to go to find out more about this from people such as yourself or other organizations and people that you respect?
I think a good space to look at is the Stop Killer Robots campaign website. I mean, this is clearly looking at the whole issue from a humanitarian disarmament point of view. But this is just a global movement of NGOs, very smart people. They also do research. So you will also find from their website a big repository of where we are in terms of technology, like what's happening, what is being developed in the world. And that is, I think, a good first place to dip your toe in and then go from there.
And that's a wrap for our Group Mind dive into the military use of AI. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, a computational psychologist from Stanford University reported that GPT-4 successfully completed 75% of tasks typically used to evaluate the human ability known as theory of mind, matching the performance of an average 6-year-old child. Theory of mind refers to the ability to understand and infer the mental states of others, such as their beliefs, desires, intentions, and emotions, even when these states differ from one's own. This skill is essential for navigating social interactions, as it enables empathy, effective communication, and moral reasoning. Humans typically develop this ability early in childhood, and it is central to our cognitive and social success. The study's author, Michał Krasinski, who was on this show in episodes 186 and 187 and referred to some of this work there, said, quote, "What is often overlooked, I certainly initially overlooked it, is that these algorithms do more than just model behavior. Since behavior is rooted in psychological processes, predicting it necessitates modeling those underlying processes." End quote. Next week, I'm going back to my very first TEDx talk in 2018 to deconstruct and explain its message about AI, which has become more relevant again recently. This is the one that I haven't talked about yet. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.